the shortcut that changed the world. Every day, a steady procession of ships moves through a strip of water that, at its narrowest point, is barely wider than a football field. Container ships stacked high with manufactured goods, oil tankers carrying fuel that powers cities and industries, bulk carriers loaded with grain, steel, and raw materials. Together, they account for roughly 5% of global trade. It's an easy number to repeat. It's much harder to visualize. 5% of everything that crosses the world's oceans, food that ends up on grocery shelves, fuel that keeps power plants running, components used inside factories, materials that become roads, buildings, and infrastructure. All of it passing through a corridor less than 50 miles long. On most days, it works quietly enough that no one notices. That isn't an accident. It's how systems like this are meant to function. The most important systems in the modern world don't ask for attention. They don't announce themselves. They don't feel impressive when they are working properly. They operate in the background day after day, doing exactly what they were designed to do, until something interrupts them. A delay, a bottleneck, a storm, a mechanical issue. Schedules begin to slip. Costs rise. Ships wait longer than expected. And questions surface that haven't needed answers for a very long time. How did so much come to depend on something so narrow? Why does a problem in one place travel so quickly and so far? And who decided that cutting a shortcut through jungle and the rock was a sensible way to organize the world's trade? The answer has little to do with convenience. It has more to do with time, money, and the long-standing human effort to make geography work in our favor. This is not a story about ships. It's a story about the systems we build to move goods faster, cheaper, and with fewer surprises. And about what happens when those systems become reliable enough that we stop noticing them at all. Part 1. Before the shortcut existed. Before the canal existed, there was only geography, and geography does not negotiate. If you wanted to move goods between the Atlantic and the Pacific, there was only one practical option available. You went the long way. Ships began along the eastern coastline of the Americas, crossed the equator, and continued south toward the narrow, dangerous waters at the tip of South America. From there, they rounded Cape Horn and turned north again, climbing the Pacific coast toward their destination. It was not a shortcut. It was an endurance test. The distance alone added thousands of miles, but distance was only part of the problem. Time at sea introduced risks that no amount of planning could fully control. Weather ruled everything. Winds shifted without warning. Storms arrived suddenly and lingered longer than expected. Ocean currents slowed progress to a crawl or pushed ships far off course. Navigation errors were common and recovery was never guaranteed. Entire vessels disappeared. Sometimes wreckage washed ashore months later. Often nothing was ever found. A single voyage could stretch across seasons. A shipment that left port under favorable conditions might arrive months later damaged, delayed, or not arrive at all. From a modern perspective, this feels inefficient. But this was not inefficiency caused by poor planning or outdated knowledge. It was inefficiency imposed by the physical shape of the planet. Those constraints shaped the global economy in ways that are easy to overlook today. Certain goods simply were not worth shipping over such distances. Others were too fragile, too perishable, or too costly to insure. Trade routes formed not because they were optimal, but because they were survivable. Ship captains planned voyages like long campaigns rather than simple trips. They studied historical weather records, seasonal currents, and prevailing winds. Timing mattered as much as direction. Leaving port a few weeks too early or too late could mean sailing directly into danger. Insurance companies gained quiet influence. Premiums rose and fell based on routes, seasons, and recent losses. A year of severe storms could reshape shipping prices across entire regions. Some routes became financially impossible almost overnight. For crews, the cost was personal. Months passed at sea without communication. No letters, no updates, no way to reassure families waiting at home. A ship might be gone for half a year or more, and silence was considered normal. From shore, businesses operated with long assumptions built in. Delays were expected. Losses were calculated in advance. Inventory planning included the possibility that goods simply would not arrive. This was the rhythm of global trade for centuries. Empires expanded and contracted within these constraints. Markets adapted around them. Entire economic systems learned to function despite the vast distance between coasts. Acceptance, however, did not mean satisfaction. Throughout history, people have shown a persistent belief that natural limits can be reduced, managed, or worked around. That belief grows stronger when those limits carry a high financial cost. The narrow stretch of land connecting North and South America drew attention for generations. Maps were studied. Surveys were conducted. Proposals circulated quietly among merchants, engineers, and governments. The idea itself was straightforward. What if ships did not have to go around? What if distance could be reduced, not by sailing faster, but by changing the route entirely? The appeal was immediate. Shorter routes meant faster delivery. Faster delivery lowered costs. Lower costs encouraged more trade, greater profit, and broader influence. Entire industries stood to benefit. Entire economies could be reshaped. The value of such a shortcut was never in doubt. The real question was whether it could be built at all, and if it could, whether anyone was willing to accept what it would demand in return. Part 2. The Dream That Refused to Die. The idea of cutting a passage through the narrow stretch of land connecting North and South America did not begin with modern engineering. It began with impatience. As early as the 16th century, Spanish explorers studied maps and questioned why ships had to travel thousands of extra miles when the distance between the oceans was so small. Surveyors sketched possible routes. Merchants imagined weeks, shaved off voyages and fortunes, saved in fuel and time. The logic was obvious. The reality was not. The jungle was dense. The terrain was unpredictable. Rainfall was constant. For centuries, the tools and methods required to make such an idea work simply did not exist, so the idea lingered. It waited. By the late 19th century, conditions appeared to change. Steam power had transformed transportation. Engineering projects grew larger and more ambitious. Global trade accelerated, and confidence followed. To many observers, the moment seemed right. One man, in particular, believed the problem had already been solved. Ferdinand de Lesseps was widely respected, even celebrated. He had overseen the construction of the Suez Canal, a project that reshaped global shipping and stood as a symbol of modern engineering success. Suez worked. It worked smoothly, predictably, and at sea level. That success carried weight. It shaped expectations and narrowed imagination. De Lesseps believed the challenge of canals had already been answered. What remained, in his view, was repetition on a larger scale. The land in Central America was different, but not different enough to require a new approach. The plan reflected that belief: a direct cut across the isthmus, a sea-level canal modeled after Suez. Minimal locks. Minimal elevation change. Ships moving straight from one ocean to the other. On paper, the design appeared elegant. On the ground, it unraveled almost immediately. The land resisted every assumption built into the plan. Unlike the desert terrain of Suez, this region was mountainous and unstable. Rivers surged without warning. Rain fell relentlessly, turning excavation sites into mud. Earth that had been cleared one day collapsed back into place the next. Machinery sank. Trenches refilled. Progress stalled. Schedules collapsed. Costs escalated. Then came disease. Yellow fever and malaria spread rapidly through the workforce. Illness advanced faster than construction. Entire crews were sidelined. Death became part of the daily routine. At the height of the effort, thousands of workers were dying each year. This was no longer a purely engineering challenge. It had become a logistical and human crisis, layered on top of a failing design. Still, the project continued. Money flowed in from investors convinced that setbacks were temporary. Confidence lingered longer than evidence supported. After all, the man in charge had succeeded before. That history carried enormous influence. Eventually, the land asserted itself. The French effort collapsed under the combined weight of disease, engineering failure, and financial loss. Investors were ruined. Public confidence evaporated. Careers ended. Reputations were permanently damaged. What remained were abandoned cuts, rusting equipment, and the jungle slowly reclaiming what had been taken from it. There is a pattern here that appears repeatedly in large-scale human endeavors. Success creates certainty. Certainty hardens into assumption. Assumption narrows judgment. De Lesseps was not careless. He was experienced. And experience, when it goes unexamined, can become a liability. The canal was never beyond reach, but it resisted being built according to borrowed solutions. It required adaptation, patience, a willingness to abandon plans that looked good on paper but failed in practice. For a time, that lesson remained unlearned. The failed attempt left behind unanswered questions that refused to fade. If the canal could not be built this way, could it be built another way? And if so, who would be willing to try again, fully aware of what the land had already demanded once before? Part 3. Engineering Reality and the Elegant Solution. After the French effort collapsed, the land did not change. The rain still fell. The rivers still surged. The jungle continued to reclaim anything left unattended. What changed was the approach. When the United States assumed control of the project in the early 20th century, engineers confronted a simple fact. The canal had failed before because the land had been treated as an obstacle to defeat rather than a condition to work within. This time, that assumption was set aside. Instead of insisting on a sea level canal, engineers accepted elevation as an unavoidable feature of the landscape. The isthmus rose well above sea level. Rivers flooded without warning. Rainfall could exceed 200 inches a year. Excavated earth shifted, collapsed, and refused to stay where it was placed. Trying to force a flat channel through that environment had already proven catastrophic. So the plan changed. Ships would no longer be forced to remain at sea level. They would be lifted. The solution took shape in the form of locks. The concept itself was straightforward. The execution demanded precision. A ship would enter a chamber. Gates would close behind it. Water would be added or released, raising or lowering the vessel in controlled stages. Gravity would handle most of the work. This single decision resolved several problems at once. Excavation requirements dropped dramatically. Flooding became manageable. The canal transformed from a vulnerable trench into a regulated system. It would no longer cut through the land. It would operate within it. Artificial lakes and controlled waterways became central to the design. Rainfall, once an adversary, was incorporated into the system. Water that had disrupted earlier efforts now powered the canal's movement. This approach favored discipline over spectacle. It emphasized reliability. It emphasized durability. It emphasized function over appearance. The lock system required constant coordination. Gates had to seal perfectly. Chambers had to balance enormous volumes of water. Mechanical systems needed to perform consistently in harsh conditions, day after day. Failure was not an option. Many of the original components operated for decades with only modest upgrades. That longevity reflected deliberate choices made early in the design process. Engineers assumed wear would occur. They planned for adjustment. Systems were built to be repaired, not admired. That mindset extended across the entire project. Equipment was selected for reliability rather than novelty. Redundancy was built into critical systems. Procedures accounted for human error instead of pretending it could be eliminated. Even disease, which had devastated earlier efforts, was addressed through methodical intervention. Standing water was drained, housing improved, sanitation enforced. These measures did not eliminate illness, but they reduced it to levels that could be managed. This was engineering of a different kind. Not just machines, but conditions. Progress followed a steady rhythm. Work advanced incrementally. There were no dramatic milestones announced, no declarations of imminent success. Each day looked much like the one before it. Over time, those days accumulated. When the canal opened in 1914, it did not feel like a dramatic breakthrough. It felt finished. Ships began passing through what would become known as the Panama Canal, moving from ocean to ocean with a consistency that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. A journey that once consumed months could now be completed in hours. The change did not come from altering the world. It came from understanding it. There is a lesson here that extends well beyond this single project. Systems that last tend to be grounded in restraint. They acknowledge limits. They anticipate failure. They value maintenance as much as innovation. The canal endured because it was designed to function under real conditions, not ideal ones. Its success grew out of listening carefully, adjusting deliberately, and committing to solutions that could be sustained long after the excitement of construction faded. That discipline is what allowed the system to hold, and it remains the reason it still does. Part 4. Power, Politics, and Control. Once the canal opened, its significance became clear almost immediately. It was more than an engineering accomplishment. It was leverage. Control of the canal meant control over time, cost, and access. Ships that passed through it moved faster, arrived sooner, and operated at lower expense. Geography alone created an advantage that could not be easily replicated. That kind of advantage rarely remains neutral. From the outset, the canal was tied to questions of power and sovereignty. Who operated it, who protected it, and who ultimately benefited from its existence. For global trade, the canal acted as a stabilizing force. Routes shortened, schedules became more predictable. Costs dropped across entire supply chains. For politics, it became a point of pressure. Military planners recognized its value quickly. A navy that could move ships between oceans without circumnavigating a continent gained flexibility. Others lacked. Supply lines shortened. Response times improved. Strategic options expanded. In periods of calm, the canal functioned as commerce. In periods of tension, it functioned as insurance. At times, it functioned as leverage in negotiations that had little to do with shipping itself. As the 20th century progressed, global trade expanded around this new reality. Shipping routes reorganized. Ports rose or declined based on their proximity to the canal and their ability to integrate into its flow. Entire regions felt its influence without ever seeing it directly. The canal shaped outcomes quietly, through schedules and pricing, rather than speeches or declarations. Yet it was never just an international asset. It existed within the borders of a nation. That fact mattered. Over time, questions of ownership and control became unavoidable. Who should benefit most from the canal's operation? Who should bear the risks that came with it? And who should decide how it was managed? These questions were not resolved quickly. The eventual transfer of control unfolded gradually through negotiation rather than confrontation. Agreements were signed. Responsibilities shifted. Operations continued. This pattern is common among systems that last. They do not transform through sudden disruption. They evolve through handovers, revisions, and incremental decisions that rarely attract public attention. Throughout these changes, the canal continued to do its job. Ships moved through, schedules held, trade flowed. For most people, nothing appeared to change at all. That quiet continuity is often the clearest sign that a system is functioning as intended. Part 5. The system under stress. For most of its operating life, the canal's primary challenge was volume. More ships, more cargo, tighter schedules. That pressure was anticipated from the beginning. Trade grows. Ships grow. Traffic concentrates where time and cost can be saved. What drew far less attention for much of the canal's history was a quieter constraint that sits beneath everything else. Water. Each ship that passes through the lock system relies on fresh water to move between elevations. Gravity provides the force, but the water itself is released downstream with every transit. Once it moves through the system, it is no longer available for immediate reuse. For decades, this arrangement functioned with little concern. Rainfall replenished the lakes that feed the canal. Seasonal variation existed, but it stayed within predictable limits. Reservoir levels rose and fell, and operations adjusted smoothly. There was margin in the system. Over time, that margin narrowed. Extended dry seasons reduced water levels in the canal's reservoirs. Lower levels translated directly into fewer transits per day. Draft restrictions limited how heavily ships could be loaded. Schedules shifted. Queues formed. Nothing dramatic announced itself. Operations continued. From the outside, the canal still appeared to function as it always had. Ships moved through. Traffic flowed. Trade continued. Inside the system, however, small adjustments accumulated. Transit slots became more valuable. Shipping companies altered routes and timing to secure access. Delays rippled outward through supply chains that now operate with far less slack than they once did. Ports, thousands of miles away, felt the effects indirectly. Delivery windows tightened. Inventory buffers shrank. Costs shifted in subtle ways that were easy to overlook in isolation and difficult to trace in aggregate. This is how stress reveals itself in mature systems. There is rarely a single point of failure. Instead, pressure redistributes. Small constraints compound. Adaptation replaces disruption. Modern ships intensified these dynamics. Vessel size increased faster than many early planners anticipated. Even with later expansions to accommodate larger traffic, each transit now represents a greater concentration of economic value. When movement slows, consequences multiply. Fuel burns while ships wait. Crews remain idle. Timelines compress elsewhere in the system to compensate. Delays that begin at one point surface weeks later in places that seem disconnected from the original cause. Still, nothing breaks. That endurance reflects the canal's underlying design philosophy. It was built to absorb strain without collapsing. It was meant to adjust gradually rather than fail suddenly. What it was never designed to do was fade permanently into the background. Water constraints have brought the system back into view, not as a crisis, but as a signal. A reminder that even well-built infrastructure requires attention as conditions evolve. Infrastructure exists within time, climate patterns shift, trade volumes change, economic assumptions age. What once worked effortlessly begins to demand closer management. This pattern extends far beyond the canal. Power grids operate under heavier and more variable loads. Rail networks manage traffic densities their original designers never modeled. Data cables carry volumes that once belonged to theory rather than practice. Most days, these systems perform exactly as expected. On the days they struggle, the issue is rarely incompetence. It is scale meeting reality. The canal's current challenges do not suggest failure. They indicate longevity. They show what happens when a system built carefully continues operating long enough for the world around it to change. Part 6. Why hidden systems matter. The canal remains one of the most studied infrastructure projects in history. Most of that attention gravitates toward its ambition, the scale of the excavation, the difficulty of cutting a passage between two oceans, the sheer audacity of attempting it at all. What receives less attention is what happens after the work is finished. The system becomes ordinary. Ships arrive according to schedule. Gates open and close. Water rises and falls. Transit times hold. Nothing about this looks remarkable once it becomes routine. That ordinariness is the real achievement. Systems that last do not remain impressive. They settle into repetition. They fade into the background of daily life and draw notice only when something interrupts the pattern. This creates a quiet vulnerability. When reliability becomes familiar, it becomes expected. When it becomes expected, it receives less scrutiny. Budgets tighten. Maintenance is deferred. Attention drifts toward projects that promise visible change rather than continued stability. The canal offers a clear example of what long-term thinking looks like when it is taken seriously. Its designers anticipated wear. They assumed components would fail over time. They planned for repair rather than permanence. Redundancy was not an afterthought. Access for maintenance was treated as a requirement rather than a compromise. These choices rarely inspire admiration. They do, however, keep systems operating across decades and generations. Modern life depends on arrangements like this far more than it depends on novelty. Electricity that arrives consistently matters more than experimental energy concepts. Water systems that function every day matter more than innovative treatment ideas that never scale. Transportation networks that operate predictably matter more than dramatic redesigns that disrupt existing flows. Progress depends on continuity. Hidden systems provide that continuity. They create the stability that allows other parts of society to experiment, expand, and change without destabilizing everything beneath them. When these systems falter, the effects spread quickly. Delays multiply. Costs rise. Confidence erodes. When they function well, their contribution is easy to overlook. The canal occupies that space. For more than a century, it has shaped trade routes, military planning, and economic geography. It continues to do so quietly, through schedules and capacity rather than announcements. Its current stresses do not reduce its importance. They clarify it. They reveal how much depends on planning decisions made long ago, and how responsibility does not end when construction does. Systems inherit the future conditions they were never designed to predict. History often highlights moments of change. Just as much of it is shaped by persistence, by systems that continue operating because people choose to maintain them, because funding is allocated, because schedules are respected, because attention is paid even when nothing appears to be wrong. The canal's value rests there, in the discipline required to keep something working long after the excitement of building it has passed, in the willingness to treat maintenance as stewardship rather than an inconvenience. That approach rarely draws applause. It does, however, keep the world moving. Subscribe to The Invisible Backbone. Long-form stories about the systems that quietly hold the modern world together, how they formed, why they matter, and what they're still shaping today.